Jill, so excited to have you on the show. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me, Stephanie. I'm excited for this conversation.
Me too. I think homesteaders are super cool. So I'm looking forward to getting to know everything that you have to offer and all the encouragement you're going to give me. I already know after we stop talking, I'm going to like get chickens and maybe a cow.
Yes, totally. I have that effect on people. So,
Well, I would love it if we started today by you, first of all, telling us how you got here. How did you become a passionate homesteader? But also, perhaps you can paint a little picture in our minds of what your homestead looks like, what you have, how big it is, all those things.
sure, yeah. So I came through this kind of through the back door. People always assume that I come from a farm family or a ranch family, and I don't. I was raised like a very typical '90s kid in a little neighborhood in like one of those, '90s houses, kind of split level type of deal. So very conventional in every way. But I always had this weird spark in me that I just wanted something a little different, and I wanted to live in the country, and I wanted horses, especially, and animals and barns. And so I was always the weird child. I didn't have a lot of friends, but I kind of kept following that spark as I got older and into high school and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And that spark led me to Wyoming when I was 18 to attend a horse college or a college that had a horse program here. And so that was my first kind of step outside of the realm of normal, because I think one of the big pieces of homesteading is that's an obstacle for people is you kind of have to be willing to let go of looking like everyone else and living like everyone else, and maybe having your friends think you're regular, right? You have to be willing to be weird. And so that first step, moving to Wyoming, was important. I met my husband here, and then we started looking when we got married, we started looking for our first property. And we knew we wanted something different. Again, I had that desire for different, but I didn't know what it was. I couldn't flesh it out. And that ended up being this fixer upper farmhouse that was 45 minutes away from town, 45 minutes away from grocery stores or anything, any piece of civilization. And back then, it was 2008. Homesteading wasn't a thing. It wasn't being talked about very much. People weren't getting chickens. You couldn't get mason jars at the grocery store very easily. Like, it was very much still obscure. But when we bought this land, I was I was really struck with this thought of, like, how can I make it productive? How can I make it mean something? How can I bring it back to life? Because it was pretty run down and needed a lot of work. And so that's kind of what prompted these little baby steps. So it was a compost pile, it was chickens, it was a garden, and it blossomed into this passion that's kind of become my life's work. And so fast forward to today, we have the same 67 acres that we started with. It's changed a lot. We've built a lot of things here. We fixed up the house and fixed up the barns. We keep milk cows, egg chickens, and meat chickens. We raise pigs about every other year. We have a big garden and a greenhouse, and we're growing the majority of our food we grow ourselves. And so as our kids have come along, that's been really fun to watch them blossom into the lifestyle. So it's become my honestly my identity. So it's kind of fun to see how started off the girl in the little neighborhood, and here we are now. So
Well, you mentioned something a couple times there. You said you were a quote strange kid, and you said you were. I believe you said you were drawn to a weird lifestyle. You used the word weird a couple times, and so I guess my first question for you is homesteading only for strange and weird people, or could it be for everybody?
it definitely can be for everyone. And I like to use those terms because I definitely don't think it's weird now. I actually think it's historically very normal and very human. But in our culture, especially as our culture is racing towards everything modern and technology heavy, and we're going back the opposite direction, it's odd to people. And so I like to use those words to kind of relate to how people might see it. But um, no, I think there's a piece of this that's available for everyone. And I love helping people see the possibilities for them, because I know not everyone's going to move to 67 acres. Not everyone can move out, out to the prairie. And that's not really a prerequisite at all. It's really a mindset shift. And that's what makes me most excited, is how can we bring these old fashioned principles into every home in some way, shape, or form? And it's really attainable for everyone, even if you can't get chickens and even if you're not going to have a milk cow anytime soon.
Well, I love all of that. And that's what I want to talk to you about, which is how can we all just take in a little bit of these old fashioned principles into our home? Because as you mentioned, not everyone can move to a big acreage homestead. but also not everybody, and I would probably guess that the vast majority of my listeners don't even want to because just playing devil's advocate here, modern advances have been made to make our lives easier, and so you're taking a conscious step backward. Can you tell me about how homesteading gets you more in touch, or doesn't get you in touch? I think you're going to say it does get you more in touch with, what really matters. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you said something important there in terms of modern life has given us advancements that make our lives easier, and kind of like, why would we want to go back? Like, why are we choosing the harder way? And I think that's a really valid question, because I mean, obviously, I'm not going to sit here and say every advancement of the industrial revolution was bad, or obviously, I'm sitting here in this cushy office with a microphone and my laptop and my Wi-Fi and my camera, so we have one foot planted in the modern world, even here on the prairie. But I think the homestead mindset shift, or whatever you want to call it, this old fashioned mindset shift, starts with asking questions, lots of good questions. And one of the questions I like to ask first is, who were we before industrialism told us how to be or how to live? And I think when we start pulling back some of these layers and stripping back all this baggage of modernity, and not all of it's bad, some of it I'm very happy to have, showers and hot water, and I have vehicles and all those things. But a lot of our paradigm today has been shaped by corporations and by this move of industrialism that exalts the factory above all costs, that exalts consumerism at all costs. And it's shaped how we think and how we live as modern people in ways that aren't always good for us. And so, one of the first things I encourage people to do is think about how maybe certain tasks that are harder at first glance, they require more effort from you physically or mentally, how they might improve your quality of life once you partake in them. And that's kind of that first old fashioned shift. And it's not that I do everything the hard way, but there's things I consciously do the hard way that make my life better and richer in the process. And so, like, gardening is an example. It is easier, and people don't like to hear this, but it is cheaper for me to buy vegetables at the grocery store for the most part. Like, that's an unfortunate truth with the way our food is subsidized. However, I choose to garden and I choose to sweat and get my hands dirty and toil outside in the summer because I get the food, sure, but I also get the mental health benefits of being out there. It helps me ground myself. It helps me stay centered when my life gets busy. And so that's an example of how the harder path, the harder choice makes our lives more rich in the long run. And I think that applies to so many pieces of this lifestyle, whether you're doing it in a suburban setting or you're doing it in a rural setting like I am.
You're speaking to something that a recent guest on the podcast also spoke to, Lisa Bass of Simple Farmhouse Life. But you're both essentially making the same point, which is there's joy to be had, there's skills to be learned when we take the harder route. I think our culture, I don't think, I know our culture prioritizes convenience, quick and easy over the harder path. I'm thinking, cooking our food. Why cook a meal from scratch when we could get takeout, or I mean, easier route? But it's important to remember that for most of us, there's a ton of personal benefit to be had in taking the longer and perhaps more arduous route, at least some of the time. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, yeah, and not all the time. I think that's an important differentiation. Like, there's things I definitely, people like always want to poke out. Oh, you're a hypocrite here. I'm like, no, I'm not. Like, it's all on the table. I have a washing machine. I have a dishwasher. I have a car. I mean, we're not living an Amish lifestyle. We have electricity, and I think that's the beauty of homesteading in our modern era is we get to pick and choose. But there's, and that choice is powerful, and that's going to look different for every person. But that's, even science backs up this idea of when we're using our hands to do manual tasks, it actually triggers the happy chemicals in our brain. And so you think about how disconnected we are from nature, and how disconnected we are from using our hands and creation, and how disconnected we are from other people. It's no mystery why we as modern folks are kind of like, they call it the modern malaise. Like, if you look at the rates of anxiety and depression, and people are just unhappy. Even before COVID, people were just like unhappy with their lives and just kind of blah. Like it totally matches the arc of the kind of the rise of this convenience culture and rise of this exalting ease at all costs. And so I think there's a correlation there, that there's a lot of good stuff to be found when we're doing these counterintuitive choices.
Yeah, you mentioned modern malaise there. I love that. I tend to call it like just a general disillusionment, but I'm going to adopt the modern malaise. It's, we're all working so hard. We're all overtired, and most of us are off also disillusioned. We're experiencing that modern malaise. And so I find myself wondering, for me in my own home, like, am I working really hard at the wrong things? It's just a question that always pops up, and I don't know what the answer is, but I'm working really hard, and I'm also disillusioned. So am I putting my effort every single day into the wrong things? And so I guess that brings me to asking you, where did we collectively as a culture, like, where and when did we get off track?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've spent a lot of time the last couple years researching that. Um, for me, and at least in my opinion, in my reading, I think it kind of started at that peak of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And again, it's not that that was all bad. People, the historians call that one of the greatest advancements in all of human history. So there's a lot of good things that happened, life-saving inventions and things. But you really start to see this change in people's mindsets and how they lived because of those advancements. And we started to take a more exploitive approach to our world and how we were treating nature. I think humans always had that tendency, but with the advancements, we started to have the tools to really just kind of pillage the earth around us and the prairies and the west and the plains. And you start to see those shifts in again, convenience was prioritized. I was looking at some different writings from the 1920s when the rise of this I think, what did they call it? It wasn't consumerism, consumptionism. It was like they actually, the marketers were referring to it as like this religion of consumptionism, and they were actively promoting it. They weren't hiding it. They were trying to get people to buy more than they needed, because up to that point there was this idea that people are going to go to the store, they're going to go to the mercantile and buy what they needed, but they're not going to buy more than they needed. And it was really, they almost had to train the consumer to buy beyond what their normal human needs were. And so you see this push and this concentrated effort from marketers and corporations and factories to get people to prioritize ease. And also they kind of denigrated this more homespun, close to the earth lifestyle. And there's a lot of messaging that that's like for the lower classes, and that's like for people who aren't as intelligent. And so you just see that shift. I think it's one thing piled on the other, and it kind of brought us to where we are today. And I think a lot of people don't even think about it. I know I didn't. It was just like, here I am, a modern person, and it's 2020 or 2018 or whatever, and you just think that our culture now is just how it's always been. But if you start to look back 150 years, you realize it's not necessarily the case. We are kind of living in this world that's propped up by a lot of messaging and a lot of agendas that aren't always like, that's not how we have to do things. We have a lot of choices to go blaze our own trail.
Hmm. Yeah, as you're speaking, I'm thinking there. It's the messaging, it's the marketing, it's also the shift as we embrace more products of convenience. What we're really doing is over the generations, we're separating ourselves from the knowledge of having these self-sufficient skills, so that here we are in 2023. I'm because, and no offense to my mom and my grandma and my ancestors, but they had skills that I no longer have. And so the products of convenience are, unless I actively try and reteach myself these important skills, they're gone. My only option is the products of convenience. We're going to get into the how, Jill. So how can those of us listening, hopefully we, sparked some interest um, in the previous part of our conversation, but how can we like incorporate some of that into our lives? Um, Go ahead.
Oh, I love this question. I love the action part. So I always recommend that people start with food, because we're all eating 3 times a day at least, and it affects our health, it affects our families, and it also gives us a chance to affect change on the world around us in a really powerful way with our buying choices. And so for me, oh my goodness, so sorry. I'll start over here. Um, so for me, that started with, I think the first just kind of baby step was, what can I make from scratch? And just thinking outside the box of, okay, so I was buying tortillas and buying yogurt and buying all these things. My pantry looked like the standard American pantry. Like, which one of those could I make at home with simple ingredients? And so I honestly, I'm a little bit of a kitchen nerd, but I had so much fun in the early years of our homestead, like having these revelations of, oh my gosh, you can actually make yogurt at home. And oh my gosh, I can actually make enchilada sauce without a can. And it's way simpler than you've been led to believe. Like so many of these things, we've been told are complicated because, and so we have to buy the box mix or we have to buy the can, and they're really not that complicated, and they're better for you, and it's triggering that circuit in our brain that uses our hands and gives us a happy chemical. So you're getting all kinds of benefits. But yeah, start with the food, make things from scratch, then maybe start looking at where you're buying your food. And I still buy food from the regular grocery store, absolutely. But I also grow some of it. I get some from farmers markets. I get some from local producers. I buy a lot in bulk because that reduces the amount of trash and waste that we create from our kitchen. And so I'd say start there, ask a lot of questions, get creative, and see where it takes you.
Hmm. Yes, and I'll just add to that. Start where you have an interest. I mean, if cooking's not your thing, maybe don't start there. Maybe so for me, I like cooking. However, we have like a great, adult education program in my town. A couple years ago, I saw, they were having a soap making class. I was like, oh, that sounds lovely. So I signed up, and that was just, first of all, it was fun. Second of all, I learned a new skill, and third of all, I got to flex my own brain, I guess, for lack of a better word. Like I really get encouragement and motivation from trying something new and succeeding. I get a lot of joy out of that. So think about what, makes you light up. What lights you up? I would ask.
That's a great point. And I know not everyone loves cooking. So that's a good idea, because if you want to have those quick wins when you're starting and you don't want to be like drudging through, oh my gosh, I'm making bread and I don't want to make bread. Gardening, if that is your thing, if you've been growing flowers, maybe throw some vegetables in, or soap, or candles, or making homemade house cleaners, or making homemade knitting, fabric art. So yeah, the sky's the limit. It just kind of, yeah, find what makes you feel excited.
Right. And because, we're talking about incorporating a little tiny bit of the homesteading mindset into our homes. Like if you take up knitting, for example, that does not mean you have to knit every future pair of socks your family wears. Like we do not have to be completely self-sufficient, but we can start to reteach ourselves these old self-sufficient skills, so that we can pass them on. Right? Like I'm not making every bar of soap for my family. I'm not growing every vegetable. However, I am learning these skills, teaching myself these skills, teaching my children these skills, and having fun in the process. I think that's what really gets lost in these conversations about self sufficiency, which is like people seem to think it's a drudgery. I don't. I think of it as learning new hobbies.
Yes, and that's a great point, and I think that does get lost a lot, because there surely are hard days. Like we've had, gardens get hailed out and animals die, so there's hard days. But I have fun with it. And if I didn't have fun with it at the beginning, and I had fun making all sorts of weird things, homemade toilet bowl cleaner back in the early days. Like I thought that was fun because I could, like you said, figure out something that I didn't know how to do and figure out that skill, and I got excited. So yeah, it's all fun. It's still fun. Like I still get a little charge from the fresh tomatoes and being outside with the chickens. So the fun, it keeps you motivated through the hard times for sure.
So, what would you say then to listeners who are hearing our talk today and are saying to themselves, are you kidding me? You, Stephanie, and you, Jill, are so out of touch. I do not have time to do anything. I am so overworked and overtired. There's not a spare second in my days. What are you talking about? Do you have anything to say to them?
Yeah, and that's, I think, valid, right? We're all busy, especially moms. Modern moms are so busy. We have so many demands placed on us from culture and such. Um, First off, I think there's always that conversation of what can we remove from our schedule, but that's like a whole nother conversation of, how much are we saying yes to that is an obligation, or we're doing out of we feel like we have to and we really could pull that out. But I would say, if you're feeling that, oh my gosh, this is too much, just look at the pieces that are simple and that you could add in kind of by default. And I would also recommend, sometimes, and I even have this tendency living out in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes my default activity when I'm tired or I'm stressed is I reach for my phone and I just start scrolling, right? We all do that. It's a very addictive device. But I've learned if I can even take 10 minutes instead of scrolling and choose to do something manual, or choose to do something that's maybe a little more old fashioned, where maybe I'm out, walk outside, or I sit in the grass, or I dig my hands in the soil, or I water a plant. Um, I start to feel the benefit. It's almost a form of self care. And so for me, self care, I don't, I'm not going to get my nails done, or I'm not sitting in the bubble bath as much. That's fine if that's your jam for self care. But that self care for me looks a little bit different. But it still fills my cup in a lot of different ways. So I would say, it doesn't have to be a whole nother thing you're adding into your already bursting schedule. It can replace maybe some of the tech activities that make us feel even more scattered and overwhelmed sometimes we don't realize it. And it can be as simple as 5 minutes of sitting outside and breathing, or laying on the grass and connecting with nature. So it doesn't have to be an ordeal necessarily.
Oh, I love that answer, Jill, because you flipped my question on its head. I was asking, how can we add something without extra stress? And you're saying we don't need to add something to adopt that homestead mindset, to adopt that homestead mindset. I can't say that phrase for the life of me. But you're saying take something away. Like if you are feeling that modern malaise that we discussed earlier, take something away. Maybe recenter yourself without the tech. I love that because guess what? I don't care how busy we all are. We can all put our phone away for 5 minutes. Can we not?
Yes. Yes, we can. Yep. Guilty. Yes.
So let's talk a little bit more about that homestead mindset shift. Just slightly more for people who don't want to add gardening or composting or knitting or soap making or cheese making or whatever the thing is, but they do want to start, getting their mind right, let's say. What are some of those other mindset shifts that those of us listening can start to mull over?
Yeah. Um, so if you don't want to partake in one of those big activities, right? Because those are big. Sourdough's a big deal. Gardening's a big deal. It's not hard. None of it's hard, but it does take brain power. Takes focus. Um, so I think a big one is connecting with nature. If you look back at how disconnected we are as modern folks with nature, it's quite amazing. So we live in what I like to call the human zoo almost in certain aspects. Like we just live in everything around us is man made for the most part in many cases, right, where it's asphalt and concrete and particle board and sheetrock and plastic all the time. And so our bodies aren't really designed for that. We're natural beings designed to live in a natural world. And so how can you reconnect with your biology? And so, I like to recommend, if you live, you know in the middle of a big city and you work in an office all day, maybe you take your lunch hour outside and you just let the sunlight hit your skin. You sit under a tree in the grass, you touch the earth. Touching the earth is important, whether you're touching soil or you're touching grass. That's really, really important. There's actual microbes in the soil that have been shown to have antidepressant effects. They actually help our mental health. And so you think how so many people are scared to get dirty, but maybe that's some of the pieces that we're missing. So get connected with nature. One of the cool side effects of that is you start to care more about your impact on the planet, and how much trash you're creating, or the effects of your choices. And so that ends up helping us do more good in terms of our environmental mindset, and as well as connecting our bodies back into our natural habitat. So it's those simple choices. It's going for a walk. It's giving yourself solitude, right? Think of a old time homesteader would have had a lot of time to think. And in our modern culture, the only time we have to think outside of distractions is often the shower. But the shower is where we get a lot of good ideas, right? Like I always get amazing ideas in the shower. So give yourself solitude. And then finally, a really cool old fashioned practice is community. cultivating community. And in our modern world, we're so screen connected that we forget those face to face connections often. So decide to have people over for a dinner party, have a neighborhood block party, get together and have a themed dinner, or put together some sort of event for your town. Like all of those are cultivating really important old fashioned principles that don't have to, involve gardening or sourdough bread necessarily.
Oh, Jill, I'm so happy you came on my show because I love this conversation. I wonder if, step one for people listening who don't want to make the sourdough, which by the way, I must say, I do have a sourdough starter starting right now. That's my spring slash summer um, goal. We'll see how it works. The thing smells really bad right now. But for those of us who don't want to be homesteaders, maybe like step one to re-adopting that old-fashioned mindset is to, let me say that again, old-fashioned mindset is to get outside of our own four walls. Like I feel like we're always inside generally. Generally, I'm talking about our culture, right? We tend to be inside on our phones, isolated. Maybe step one is to get outside of our homes, like get into nature, like be around other people and start to really cultivate that sense of community that I wonder whether, technology is again taking us away from. I love everything that you're doing, and I would love to come to Wyoming and see your homestead maybe sometime soon. Tell my listeners where we can find more of you and all your goodness on the World Wide Web.
Yeah, for sure. So the Prairie Homestead is my original blog. It's been going on for 12 years now, and it's still going strong. So it's kind of the hub where you can connect to all the different things I do, the podcast and the posts and such. I also have a book coming out in September of this year that's called Old Fashioned on Purpose. And it's a lot of the things we talked about today and, giving people those baby steps, even if they don't live in the country, even if they're not going to buy a milk cow, how to get more connected with who they are and what makes them human. So that will be available. It's at oldfashionedbook.com. And yeah, so that's where I'm at. That's what I do.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Jill. I wish you and your family and your homestead so much success. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie. It was my pleasure.